She slapped him so hard the entire street went silent. A woman alone in a Wyoming frontier town, no money, no protection, married to a stranger she'd never met, and already making enemies. They expected her to break before the snow fell. But Mara Vance didn't come here to beg. She came to survive. And when the men who hunted her finally arrived with guns and the law on their side, she didn't run. She buried them under a mountain. If you want to know how a woman with nothing became the one thing no man could control, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered saloon, kicking up a cloud of pale dust that hung in the dry Wyoming air like a veil. Mara Vance stepped down slowly, her boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud that felt heavier than it should have. She straightened her back, adjusted the brim of her hat, and looked down the main street of a town that had no name she cared to remember. It wasn't much. A dozen buildings, maybe less. Wood planks warped by sun and winter. A livery stable. A general store with a faded sign. Men in dusty coats standing in clusters, watching her like she was something they hadn't ordered but showed up anyway. She didn't look back at the coach. There was nothing behind her worth turning for. "You Mara Vance?" The voice came from a man leaning against a post near the saloon entrance. He was older, maybe 50, with a graying beard and eyes that didn't bother hiding their judgment. His hat was pulled low, but she could still see the smirk underneath. "I am." "You don't look like much." Mara turned her head slowly, met his eyes without blinking. "And you don't look like you matter." The smirk faltered. A couple of men nearby shifted their weight, suddenly interested. "Got a mouth on you," the man said, louder now. "Crow know what he's getting into?" "Don't know," Mara said flatly. "But I know what I'm getting into, and it's not a conversation with you." She started walking toward the general store, her small travel bag slung over one shoulder. The man pushed off the post and stepped into her path. "You think you're going to last up there? Woman like you? Alone with him in the mountains?" Mara stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, then set her bag down slowly. The street went quieter. Even the horses seemed to pause. "Move," she said. "Or what?" She slapped him. Not a theatrical swing, not a shove, a clean, sharp crack across the face that snapped his head to the side and left a red mark blooming on his cheek. The sound echoed off the buildings like a gunshot. The man staggered back, more from shock than force, his hand going to his face. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then something uglier. "You crazy—" "Yeah," Mara said, voice steady. "I am. So get out of my way." No one moved. The men who had been watching were staring now, some with their mouths half open. A woman in a faded blue dress stood frozen in the doorway of the store, one hand on the frame. The man opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around, saw no backup coming, and took a step back. Then another. Mara picked up her bag and kept walking. She didn't look at anyone, didn't apologize, didn't explain. She just walked into the general store like nothing had happened, the door swinging shut behind her. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of flour and tobacco and old wood. The shopkeeper, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood behind the counter like he'd been holding his breath. "You, He cleared his throat. "You need something, ma'am?" "Water," Mara said. "And directions to Elias Crow's place." The man blinked. "You're her?" "I'm her." He nodded slowly, poured her a tin cup of water from a pitcher, and slid it across the counter. She drank it in 3 long pulls, then set the cup down. "Crow's up north," the shopkeeper said quietly, "about 8 miles into the mountains. Trail starts past the livery, follows the ridge. You'll see the markers." "He coming to get me?" "Don't know." "He don't come into town much." Mara nodded. "Then I'll go to him." The shopkeeper's eyes widened. "Ma'am, it's near evening. That trail's not easy, even in daylight, and you don't know the land." "I'll manage." "There's a boarding house. I didn't come here to wait." She turned and walked back out into the street. The man she'd slapped was gone. The others were still watching, but from a distance now, like she was something they hadn't figured out yet. Mara ignored them. She walked toward the livery, boots crunching on gravel, her mind already moving past this town and everyone in it. She'd made her decision weeks ago, maybe months. Maybe the moment she realized that staying meant dying slowly, piece by piece, under the weight of a man who thought he owned her future because he'd bought her father's debts and called it a marriage contract. So she ran, not to safety, not to comfort, to a stranger named Elias Crow who'd answered an advertisement she barely remembered writing. A man who needed a wife for practical reasons and didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't kind, it was a trade. Survival for work, shelter for silence. And right now that was more than she'd had in years. The livery stable smelled like hay and manure. A young man with a patchy beard looked up from mucking a stall, saw her, and straightened. "Help you?" "I need a horse." "You got money?" Mara pulled a small coin purse from her coat pocket and dropped it on the nearest barrel. It clinked softly. Not much, but enough. The young man looked at the purse, then at her. "You're going up to Crow's place. That a problem?" "No, ma'am. Just, most folks don't go up there unless they got business." "I got business." He nodded slowly, then gestured toward a chestnut mare in the back stall. "She's steady, won't spook easy. You know how to ride?" "Enough." He saddled the horse without another word, his hands quick and practiced. Mara watched, memorizing the way he tightened the straps, the way he checked the bit. When he handed her the reins, he hesitated. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, Crow's a hard man. Quiet. Doesn't like surprises." "Good," Mara said. "Neither do I." She swung up into the saddle with less grace than she would have liked, but she didn't fall, and that was enough. The horse shifted beneath her, testing, then settled. Mara looked down at the young man. "The trail north?" He pointed past the edge of town toward a line of trees that climbed into the foothills. "Follow the ridge. Markers are carved into the trunks. You'll know it when you see the cabin." She nodded, turned the horse, and rode out. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was cooler up here, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and something wilder she couldn't name. Mara kept the horse at a steady walk, her eyes scanning the trail ahead. The markers were there, just like the boy said, small notches cut into tree bark, barely visible unless you knew to look. She didn't think about the town behind her, didn't think about the man she'd slapped or the people who would talk about it for weeks. Didn't think about the stagecoach driver who'd asked her 3 times if she was sure about this. She thought about the cold, the weight of the sky, the way the mountains seemed to close in the higher she climbed, and she thought about Elias Crow. She'd never seen his face, didn't know his voice. All she had was a letter, written in careful, blunt handwriting that didn't waste words. "I need a wife. You need a place. I won't ask where you came from. You don't ask why I'm alone. We work. We survive. That's the deal. No promises, no lies, just terms." Mara had written back the same day. "I accept." Now, riding through a forest that seemed to swallow sound, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Not because she was afraid. Fear was old, worn out, something she'd stopped listening to a long time ago. But because she didn't know what happened next. The trail narrowed. The trees thickened. The light dimmed to a deep blue-gray, and the first stars began to prick through the sky. And then she saw it. A cabin. Small, square, built from logs that looked like they'd been cut by hand and fitted with the kind of precision that didn't allow for weakness. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, thin and steady. A woodpile sat stacked against the side wall covered with canvas. A single window glowed faintly with firelight. Mara stopped the horse 20 feet from the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair pulled back, streaked with gray at the temples, a beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. He wore a heavy wool shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands, scarred, calloused, hung loose at his sides. His eyes were gray, steady, unreadable. He looked at her the way someone might look at a tree or a rock, something that existed, something to be assessed, but not something to be impressed by. Mara dismounted slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. She tied the horse to a post near the cabin, then turned to face him. "Elias Crow?" "Yeah. I'm Mara Vance." He nodded once. "I know." Silence settled between them, thick and strange. Mara didn't know what she'd expected, a greeting maybe, or a question, but she didn't get either. Elias just looked at her, his expression unchanging. "You come alone?" he asked finally. Yes? Anyone follow you? Not yet. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. Come in. You'll freeze out here. Mara walked past him into the cabin, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. The inside was warm, lit by a fire crackling in the hearth. The space was small but clean, one room divided by function. A table, a bed in the corner, shelves lined with jars, tools, and things she didn't recognize. A rifle mounted above the door. Elias closed the door behind her and moved to the fire, adding another log without looking at her. You eat yet? He asked. No. He ladled something from a pot hanging over the flames, stew maybe, or something close to it, and poured it into a wooden bowl. He set it on the table, along with a spoon and a piece of hard bread. Eat, he said. Then we'll talk. Mara sat down and ate in silence. The stew was plain but hot, and she hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. She finished the bowl, then the bread, and when she looked up, Elias was sitting across from her watching. You know how to work? He asked. I can learn. That's not what I asked. Mara met his eyes. I've worked. Just not like this. Elias leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. This isn't town. There's no help. No store 5 minutes away. Winter's coming, and when it does, we're stuck here for months. You break something, you fix it. You run out of something, you do without. You get sick, you deal with it. Understand? I understand. Good. He paused. I don't care why you're here. I don't care what you're running from. But if it shows up at my door, I need to know before it does. Mara's jaw tightened. She looked down at the empty bowl, then back at him. There's a man, she said slowly, calls himself Richard Halford. He bought my father's debts when he died, said I owed him, said if I didn't marry him, he'd take everything, house, land, everything my family had. I told him no. He didn't like that. So you ran. So I left. Elias nodded. He know where you are? Not yet, but he will. He's got lawyers, connections, money. And you think he'll come here? I think he'll try. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes steady on hers. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out into the dark. If he comes, Elias said quietly, he won't make it back down. Mara's breath caught. She didn't know if it was a threat or a promise, but the weight of it settled over her like stone. I didn't come here to make you fight my battles, she said. Elias turned, his expression unreadable. You came here to survive. That's my job now. So if he comes, it's my battle too. Mara stared at him, something twisting in her chest. Relief, maybe, or fear, or something she didn't have a name for. Why? She asked. Because you're my wife now, Elias said simply. And I don't let people take what's mine. The fire crackled, the wind rattled the shutters, and Mara realized for the first time in years that she wasn't alone. She didn't thank him, didn't cry, didn't say anything at all. She just nodded, and Elias, without another word, walked to the door and bolted it shut. The first week was brutal, not because Elias was cruel, he wasn't. He didn't yell, didn't mock, didn't watch her fail with satisfaction. He just expected her to keep up, and when she couldn't, he waited until she figured it out, which she did, slowly, painfully. She burned the first meal she tried to cook over the fire. The bread came out hard as stone. The stew boiled over, and she scalded her hand trying to pull the pot back. Elias said nothing, just handed her a cloth soaked in cold water and went back to sharpening his knife. She spilled half a bucket of water hauling it up from the creek because she didn't angle the rope right. Her shoulders ached for 2 days after. Elias showed her once how to do it properly, then left her to practice. She cut her hand gutting a rabbit. The blood wouldn't stop, and she had to wrap it tight with a strip of fabric torn from her sleeve. It throbbed for hours. Elias glanced at it, nodded, and went back to skinning the deer he'd shot that morning. He didn't coddle her, didn't praise her, didn't tell her she was doing well or that it would get easier. He just let her learn. And Mara, furious, exhausted, stubborn, refused to quit. Every morning, she woke before dawn. Elias was always already up, moving through the cabin like a shadow, checking traps, splitting wood, preparing for the day. She followed him, watched him, memorized the way he moved through the world like it owed him nothing and he owed it less. He taught her to read the sky, to know when snow was coming by the way the air tasted, to track animals by the way the grass bent, to listen to the forest and hear what didn't belong. He didn't explain things twice. Pay attention, he'd say, and that was it. So she did. She learned to build a fire that didn't smoke, to gut a fish without wasting meat, to load a rifle and brace for the kick, to walk quietly, to move carefully, to stop thinking like someone who expected the world to be soft. It wasn't, and neither was she. Not anymore. One morning, 3 weeks in, Elias handed her the rifle. "We're hunting," he said. Mara looked at the weapon, then at him. "I've never shot anything alive. Today you will." They walked for an hour, moving through the trees in silence. Elias moved like water, fluid, soundless, always aware. Mara tried to match him, her boots crunching too loud on the leaves, her breathing too quick. He stopped suddenly, held up a hand. Mara froze. Ahead, barely visible through the brush, was a deer. Young, maybe a buck. Its head was down, grazing. Elias pointed at it, then at Mara. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking slightly. The weight felt wrong. The cold metal pressed against her cheek. "Breathe," Elias murmured. "Steady. Aim low." She exhaled slowly, lined up the shot, and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the trees. The deer jerked, stumbled, and fell. Mara lowered the rifle, her heart pounding. Elias walked forward without a word, knelt beside the deer, and checked the wound. Clean. Quick. He looked back at her. Good. It was the first time he'd said that word to her. Mara swallowed hard, nodded, and followed him as he began field dressing the kill. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. She watched every cut, every motion, every practiced movement of his hands, and when he handed her the knife and told her to finish, she did. Her hands were steady. Ishik. The nights were the hardest, not because of the cold, though it was brutal, not because of the silence, though it pressed in like a weight, but because that's when Mara's mind wouldn't stop. She'd lie in the small bed Elias had built for her on the opposite side of the cabin, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. And she'd think about Richard Halford, about his smile, the way he'd cornered her in her father's study 2 days after the funeral, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Your father owed me a great deal, Miss Vance, but I'm a generous man. Marry me, and the debt disappears. You keep the house. You keep your name. Everyone wins." She'd said no. He'd smiled wider. "Think about it." A week later, men showed up at her door with legal papers. Foreclosure, seizure of property, arrest warrants for unpaid debts she didn't even know existed. She ran that night, and she hadn't stopped running until she got here. But now, lying in the dark, she wondered how long she had. Halford wasn't stupid. He was patient, and patient men were the most dangerous kind. "You awake?" Elias's voice, low and rough, cut through the silence. Mara turned her head. He was sitting by the fire, whittling something from a piece of wood. He didn't look at her. "Yeah," she said, "you think too loud." Didn't know that was possible. "It is." Mara sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends. Why'd you agree to this? The marriage? The ad? All of it." Elias was quiet for a long time. The knife in his hand moved steadily, shaving thin curls of wood into the fire. "I got tired of being alone," he said finally. Mara waited. "Not lonely," he continued, "just alone. There's a difference." "What is it?" "Lonely's when you want someone. Alone's when you've stopped expecting it." Mara looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she saw something beneath the silence. Something worn. Something that had learned not to hope. "And now?" she asked. Elias glanced at her, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "Now I got someone who doesn't quit," he said. "That's more than I expected." Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She just pulled the blanket tighter and lay back down. And for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without dreaming of running. Winter came fast. One morning, the ground was brown. The next, it was white. Snow fell in heavy, silent curtains, blanketing the mountains and turning the world into something unrecognizable. The trails disappeared. The creek froze. The cabin became an island in a sea of white, and Mara learned what survival really meant. Elias moved through the days with the same steady rhythm, checking traps, chopping wood, melting snow for water, rationing food. He didn't complain, didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge the cold beyond what was necessary. Mara matched him. Her hands, once soft, were cracked and red. Her muscles, once weak, were tight and strong. Her mind, once filled with fear, was sharper now, clearer. She could split wood without stopping, could skin a rabbit in under 5 minutes, could read the weather well enough to know when they needed to stay inside. Elias noticed. He didn't say much, but sometimes when she finished a task, he'd nod, or hand her something without being asked, or leave her the larger portion of meat at dinner. Small things, but they mattered. One night, a month into winter, a storm hit. Not the kind that passed in hours, the kind that buried everything and didn't let go. The wind screamed, the cabin shook. Snow piled against the door so high that Elias had to dig them out 3 times just to keep the chimney clear. They stayed inside for 4 days. On the 3rd night, the fire burned low. Elias added the last log and sat back, his face tight. "We're running out of wood," he said. Mara looked at the dwindling pile in the corner. "How much do we have?" "Enough for tonight, maybe tomorrow morning." "And then?" "Then we go out and get more." "In this?" Elias met her eyes. "You got another option?" Mara didn't. They went out the next morning. The storm had eased, but the cold was vicious. Mara wrapped herself in every layer she had, pulled a scarf over her face, and followed Elias into the white. The woodpile was buried. They dug for an hour, their hands numb, their breath freezing in the air. When they finally uncovered it, Elias loaded as much as he could carry onto a sled, and Mara helped him drag it back. They made 3 trips. By the time they finished, Mara couldn't feel her fingers. Her legs were shaking, her lungs burned, but the woodpile was full. Elias looked at her, snow clinging to his beard, his eyes tired but steady. "You did good," he said. Mara nodded, too cold to speak. They went inside, and Elias built the fire back up until the cabin was warm again. Mara sat close to the flames, her hands trembling as feeling slowly returned. Elias sat across from her, watching. "You're tougher than I thought," he said. "You thought I'd break?" "I thought you'd try to leave." Mara looked at him, her eyes hard. "I'm not going back, not to him, not to anything." Elias nodded slowly. "Good." And that was the end of it. But something shifted between them that night. Something unspoken. Something that made the silence feel less like distance and more like understanding. Spring was still months away. But Mara wasn't waiting for it anymore. She was here. She was standing. She was becoming something she didn't have a name for yet. And when the men came, because she knew they would, she'd be ready, not to run, to fight. The next morning, Mara woke to the sound of Elias loading the rifle. She sat up, groggy, her body still aching from yesterday's work. Through the window, the sky was pale gray, the kind of light that came before true dawn. Elias stood by the door, checking the chamber, his movements quick and practiced. "What's wrong?" Mara asked. "Tracks," Elias said without looking at her. "Outside the cabin, fresh." Mara was on her feet in seconds, pulling on her boots. "What kind?" "Human." Her stomach dropped. She crossed the cabin in 3 steps, grabbed her coat from the peg, and shoved her arms through the sleeves. "How many?" 2, maybe 3. Hard to tell with the snow. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and opened the door. "Stay close." Mara followed him outside into the cold. The air bit at her face, sharp and clean. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, leaving everything still and quiet. Too quiet. Elias moved around the side of the cabin, his eyes on the ground. Mara saw them immediately, boot prints, deep and clear, circling the perimeter like someone had been testing the walls, looking for a way in. "They didn't try the door," Elias said quietly, "just walked around, watching." "When?" "Few hours ago, maybe less." Mara's pulse hammered in her chest. She scanned the tree line but saw nothing. No movement, no shadows, just endless white and the dark line of pines. "Could be hunters," she said, though she didn't believe it. "Hunters don't circle cabins at night," Elias said. He knelt, brushed snow away from one of the prints, studied the tread. "These are town boots." Not mountain boots. Mara's throat tightened. He found me. Elias stood, his face unreadable. Maybe. Or maybe someone's just looking. He turned to her, his gray eyes steady. Either way, we don't wait to find out. Get inside, pack light. Food, water, ammunition. We leave in an hour. Leave? Mara's voice was sharper than she meant it to be. We just survived 4 days buried in here, and now you want to go back out? I want to not be cornered, Elias said flatly. If they know where we are, they'll come back with more men, and if they come back, we won't have a choice. He started toward the door. 1 hour. Move. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to say they should stay, fortify, fight if they had to. But she looked at the tracks again, at the way they circled, deliberate and patient, and she knew Elias was right. They couldn't win a siege. So she went inside and started packing. She moved fast, her hands steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. She rolled 2 blankets tight, tied them with cord, and stuffed dried meat and hardtack into a canvas sack. Elias was doing the same, his movements efficient, no wasted motion. He checked the rifle again, loaded his revolver, and shoved extra cartridges into his coat pockets. Where are we going? Mara asked. North, Elias said. There's a ridge about 6 miles up, old trapper's route. No one uses it anymore, but it's defensible. We can see anyone coming from a mile out. And if they follow us, then we deal with it. Mara didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. They left the cabin just as the sun broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. Elias locked the door, a pointless gesture, Mara thought, but he did it anyway, and they started walking. The snow was deep. Every step sank past Mara's ankles, sometimes to her knees. Her thighs burned within the first mile. Her breath came hard and fast, clouds of vapor hanging in the frozen air. Elias didn't slow down. He moved like the snow didn't exist, like the cold was just another thing to ignore. Mara gritted her teeth and kept pace. They walked for 2 hours without stopping. The forest closed in around them, thick and silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of their boots and the distant creak of ice settling on the branches. Mara's legs were shaking when Elias finally stopped. Rest, he said, nodding toward a fallen tree half buried in snow. 5 minutes. Mara collapsed onto the log, her lungs burning. She pulled her scarf down, sucked in cold air, and wiped sweat from her forehead despite the freezing temperature. Elias stood a few feet away, scanning the trail behind them. His hand rested on the rifle slung across his chest. You see something? Mara asked. Not yet. But you think they're following? I think we're not taking chances. Mara nodded, too tired to argue. She pulled a piece of dried meat from her pack, tore off a bite, and chewed slowly. It was tough, salty, and about as appetizing as leather, but it was food. Elias glanced at her. You holding up? I'm fine. You don't look fine. I said I'm fine. He didn't push, just turned back to the trail, his jaw tight. Mara hated that he could read her so easily, hated that she was struggling when he wasn't. But more than that, she hated the fear sitting heavy in her chest, the kind that made her hands shake when she wasn't paying attention. She wasn't used to running anymore. She'd thought she was done with it. Elias, she said quietly. He looked at her. If they catch up to us, they won't. But if they do, then we don't let them take you. His voice was flat, final. That's the end of it. Mara stared at him, something tightening in her throat. She wanted to ask why. Why he was doing this. Why he cared. Why he didn't just hand her over and be done with it. But she didn't, because part of her was afraid of the answer. Time's up, Elias said. He adjusted his pack and started walking again. Mara stood, shoved the rest of the meat back into her sack, and followed. They climbed higher. The air grew thinner, colder. The trees thinned out, giving way to rocky outcrops and open patches of snow that stretched for hundreds of yards. The ridge Elias mentioned finally came into view, a jagged line of stone rising above the tree line, steep and brutal. That's where we're going? Mara asked, her voice hoarse. Yeah. How do we get up there? Carefully. He wasn't joking. The climb was worse than anything Mara had done yet. The rock was slick with ice, the handholds narrow and unstable. Elias went first, testing each step before putting his full weight down. Mara followed, her fingers numb inside her gloves, her boots slipping more than once. Halfway up, her foot slid out from under her. She yelped, her body pitching backward, and for one horrible second she felt nothing but air. Then Elias's hand clamped around her wrist. He hauled her back against the rock face, his grip iron tight, his eyes locked on hers. "I got you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't let go." Mara's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Elias didn't let go until she had both hands back on the rock. Then he climbed higher, and she forced herself to follow. They reached the top just as the sun began to sink behind the peaks. The ridge was narrow, maybe 10 feet wide, with a sheer drop on one side and a steep slope on the other. But it was flat, and it was hidden, and from here they could see the entire valley below. Elias dropped his pack and immediately started clearing snow from a shallow depression in the rock. "We camp here tonight," he said. "No fire. Too visible." Mara's stomach sank. "It's going to drop below freezing." "I know. We'll freeze. Not if we stay close." Mara looked at him, then at the narrow space he was clearing. Close didn't begin to cover it, but she didn't argue. She dropped her pack, helped him spread out the blankets, and when the sun finally disappeared and the temperature plummeted, she huddled next to him under the layers of wool and canvas. Elias's body was warm, solid. He didn't say anything, didn't move except to breathe. Mara pressed her back against his chest, her teeth chattering, and pulled the blankets tighter. "You still think they're following us?" she asked after a long silence. "Yeah." "Why are you so sure?" "Because if I wanted to find someone, I'd follow their tracks. And we left a trail wide enough for a blind man to see." Mara closed her eyes. "So what do we do?" "We wait," Elias said. "And if they show up, we make sure they don't go back down to tell anyone else where we are." Mara's breath caught. "You'd kill them." "If I have to." "Just like that." "Just like that." Mara turned her head slightly, trying to see his face in the dark. "You've done it before." It wasn't a question. Elias was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost too quiet to hear. "Yeah," he said. "I have." Mara didn't ask for details, didn't ask who or when or why. She just nodded and turned back around, her heart beating slow and heavy in her chest. She should have been afraid of him, but she wasn't. Because the men who were coming, they weren't here to talk. They weren't here to reason. They were here to take her back. And if Elias hadn't been willing to stop them, she'd already be gone. So she closed her eyes, listened to the wind howl across the ridge, and tried to sleep. She didn't. Neither did Elias. They lay there in the dark, waiting, while the cold pressed down like a hand over their mouths. The next morning came slow and gray. Mara woke stiff, her muscles screaming, her face numb from the cold. Elias was already up, crouched at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the valley. "They're here," he said. Mara scrambled to her feet, ignoring the protest in her legs, and moved to his side. She followed his gaze and saw them, 3 figures moving through the snow below, maybe half a mile out. They were spread out, moving methodically, their eyes on the ground, tracking. "How long until they reach us?" Mara asked. 2 hours, maybe less if they're smart. Mara's pulse quickened. "What's the plan?" Elias stood, brushed snow off his coat, and reached for the rifle. "We move. There's a pass on the other side of this ridge. Narrow. If we can get there before they do, we can bottleneck them. And if we can't? Then we fight here." Mara nodded, her throat dry. She grabbed her pack and followed Elias as he started along the ridge, moving fast but careful. The path was treacherous, loose rock hidden under snow, gaps that dropped into nothing, wind that tried to shove them off balance. But they moved, and behind them, the men kept coming. They reached the pass just as the sun climbed higher. It was exactly what Elias said, a narrow gap between 2 walls of rock, maybe 6 feet wide, with a steep drop on one side. Defensible. Brutal. Elias stopped, set down his pack, and pulled out the rifle. "You know how to shoot this?" Mara looked at the weapon, then at him. "You taught me on deer, not people." "Same principle. Aim, breathe, pull the trigger." He handed her the rifle and drew his revolver. Mara's hand shook as she took the weapon, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. "I don't know if I can do this." she said quietly. Elias looked at her, his gray eyes hard. You can. Because if you don't, they'll take you. And I won't be able to stop all three of them alone. Mara swallowed hard, nodded, and moved to the edge of the pass. She crouched behind a boulder, rested the rifle on the rock, and sighted down the barrel. Elias took position on the other side, his revolver steady in his hand. They waited. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, light and lazy. Mara's fingers ached from the cold. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And then she saw them. 3 men, moving up the slope toward the pass. They were dressed in heavy coats, hats pulled low, rifles slung across their backs. They moved like they knew what they were doing, like they'd done this before. The man in front stopped about 50 yards out. He raised a hand and the other 2 spread out. "Elias Crow," the man shouted, his voice echoing off the rocks. "We're not here for you. Send the woman down and we'll leave you be." Elias didn't answer. The man waited, then tried again. "She's wanted for theft and breach of contract. We've got legal papers. You're harboring a fugitive." Mara's jaw clenched. Legal papers. The same lie Halford had used to chase her out of her own home. Elias still didn't move, didn't speak. The man's patience ran out. "We're coming up. Don't make this harder than it has to be." They started forward. Elias raised his revolver and fired. The shot cracked through the air like thunder. Snow kicked up 2 feet in front of the lead man, and he stumbled back, shouting. "Next one's through your chest," Elias called out. "Turn around and go home." The men didn't turn around. They scattered, ducking behind rocks, and one of them raised his rifle. "Mara!" Elias barked. "Now!" Mara squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the blast deafening. She didn't know if she hit anything. Her vision blurred from the recoil, her ears ringing, but she saw one of the men dive behind a boulder, cursing. Elias fired again, then again. The shots were precise, controlled, forcing the men to stay down. But they kept coming. One of them broke cover, sprinting toward the pass. Elias turned, aimed, fired. The man went down hard, clutching his leg, screaming. The other 2 opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. Mara ducked, her heart in her throat, and reloaded the rifle with shaking hands. She lifted it again, sighted on one of the men, and fired. The man jerked, stumbled, and fell. Mara stared, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She'd hit him. She'd actually hit him. "Mara, stay down!" Elias shouted. She dropped behind the boulder just as another bullet whined past her head. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the rifle. Elias fired twice more, his face set in a grim mask. The 3rd man was pinned behind a rock, unable to move without exposing himself. "Last chance," Elias called out. "Leave now, or you don't leave at all." For a moment there was silence. Then the man stood, hands raised, his rifle on the ground. "We're done," he shouted. "We're going." He grabbed the man with the leg wound, hauled him up, and started dragging him back down the slope. The second man, Mara couldn't tell if he was dead or just badly hurt, lay where he'd fallen. Elias watched them go, his revolver still raised, until they disappeared into the trees. Then he lowered the gun and turned to Mara. She was still crouched behind the boulder, the rifle clutched in her hands, her face pale. "You okay?" Elias asked. Mara nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. Elias crossed to her, knelt down, and gently took the rifle from her hands. "You did good. I shot him," Mara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I shot him, and he went down, and I don't know if he's alive," Elias said. "You hit his shoulder. He'll live." Mara looked at him, her eyes wide. "How do you know?" "Because I saw where you aimed, and because if you'd killed him, he wouldn't have gotten back up." Mara let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling. "I didn't think I could do it." "You didn't have a choice." "I know, but I still—" She stopped, shook her head. "I don't know what I thought it would feel like." Elias didn't say anything. He just stood, offered her his hand, and pulled her to her feet. "We need to move," he said quietly. "They might come back with more, or someone else might hear about this and come looking." Mara nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Where do we go?" "Deeper," Elias said. "There's a canyon about 10 miles north. No trails, no roads. If we can make it there, they won't find us." "And if they do?" Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we finish it." Mara didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. They packed up quickly, moving with the kind of efficiency born from necessity. Elias checked the man Mara had shot. He was unconscious but breathing, his shoulder bleeding through his coat. Elias didn't waste time trying to help him. He just took the man's ammunition and rifle, then kept walking. Mara followed, her legs heavy, her mind buzzing with too many thoughts to sort through. She'd shot someone. She'd aimed a rifle at a living person and pulled the trigger, and she'd do it again if she had to. That realization settled over her like a weight. Not guilt, exactly, but something close to it. Something that tasted like metal and fear and a kind of grim acceptance she hadn't known she was capable of. They walked for hours, pushing deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the trees thicker. The snow was untouched here, pristine and silent, and Mara realized with a cold clarity that they were leaving the world behind. No towns, no people, no law, just survival. Elias stopped at the edge of a frozen creek, knelt, and broke through the ice with the butt of his rifle. He filled their canteens, capped them, and handed one to Mara. "Drink," he said. "We're not stopping again until dark." Mara drank. The water was so cold it hurt her teeth, but she emptied half the canteen before lowering it. Elias watched her, his face tired but steady. "You're tougher than you think." "I don't feel tough," Mara said. "I feel like I'm falling apart." "You're not." "How do you know?" "Because you're still standing." Mara looked at him, something tight and painful sitting in her chest. "You really think they'll come back?" "I think Halford will keep sending men until you're dead or back under his control," Elias said bluntly. "And I think the only way to stop that is to make sure he can't." Mara's stomach twisted. "You mean kill him?" Elias didn't answer. He just stood, slung his pack over his shoulder, and started walking again. Mara followed, her mind churning. She'd never killed anyone, never even thought about it. But the idea didn't horrify her the way it should have, because Richard Halford wasn't going to stop. Legal papers, hired guns, lies dressed up as law. He'd use everything he had to drag her back. And if he got her, he wouldn't just take her freedom. He'd take everything. So maybe Elias was right. Maybe the only way to end this was to end him. They reached the canyon just before sunset. It was a deep, narrow gorge carved into the mountainside, with steep walls on both sides and a frozen stream running through the bottom. Elias led her down a treacherous path, half sliding on loose rock, until they reached the base. There, tucked into a hollow beneath an overhang, was a small shelter, barely more than a lean-to built from old timber and stone. "You knew this was here," Mara said. "I built it," Elias said, "long time ago, before the cabin." He ducked inside, checked for animals, then nodded. "It's clear. We'll stay here tonight." Mara crawled in after him. It was cramped, cold, and smelled like damp earth, but it was shelter. And after the last 2 days, that was enough. Elias unpacked their supplies, rationed out food, and they ate in silence. The wind howled above them, echoing through the canyon like a voice that couldn't find its way out. Mara pulled her knees to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, and stared at the dim light filtering through the entrance. "Elias," she said quietly. "Yeah. When this is over, if it's ever over, what happens to us?" Elias didn't answer right away. He leaned back against the stone wall, his eyes on the ceiling, his face unreadable. "I don't know," he said finally. "I never thought that far ahead." "Why not?" "Because I didn't think I'd have a reason to." Mara looked at him, something softening in her chest despite everything. "And now?" Elias met her gaze, his gray eyes steady in the fading light. "Now I do," he said. Mara's breath caught. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything to say. So she just nodded, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and lay down beside him. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, for the first time in weeks, Mara felt something close to safe. And when Elias's hand found hers in the dark, she didn't pull away. She held on. They stayed in the canyon for 3 days, not because it was safe, nowhere was safe anymore, but because Elias needed time to think, and Mara needed time to stop shaking every time she closed her eyes and saw the man go down. On the second day, Elias climbed back up to the ridge to check for signs of pursuit. He came back 2 hours later, his face grim. "They're still out there," he said, shaking snow from his coat. Different men this time, 5 of them, maybe 6. Camped about 4 miles south. Mara looked up from the small fire she'd managed to coax into life, using dried moss and twigs. How do you know they're looking for us? Because they're not hunting, they're searching, and they're moving in a grid pattern. Elias crouched beside the fire, held his hands over the weak flames. Professional, organized, someone's paying them well. Halford. Probably. Mara poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift up and die in the cold air. How long before they find us? Hard to say. The canyon's hidden, but if they keep spreading out, they'll stumble on it eventually. Elias glanced at her. We need to make a choice. What choice? We can keep running, head further north, deeper into the mountains, or we can end this. Mara's hands stilled. End it how? Elias didn't answer right away. He pulled a piece of jerky from his pack, tore it in half, and handed her one piece. There's a pass about 15 miles from here. Narrow, steep, only one way through. If we can get them to follow us there, we can trigger a slide. Mara stared at him. A rock slide. Yeah. You want to bury them. I want to make sure they can't follow us anymore. Mara's throat went dry. She looked down at the jerky in her hand, her appetite gone. That's not self-defense, Elias. That's survival, Elias cut in, his voice flat. They're not going to stop. Halford's not going to stop. And we can't keep running forever. So we either take the fight to them, or we wait until they corner us and we don't have a choice. There's always a choice. Not for people like us. Mara met his eyes, saw the exhaustion there, the weight of too many years spent alone in the mountains with nothing but silence and survival. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just being honest. And she hated that he was right. What if it doesn't work? She asked quietly. What if we set the trap and they don't follow, or they see it coming? Then we fight them the hard way, Elias said. But at least we'll have tried. Mara chewed the inside of her cheek, her mind racing. She thought about the men on the ridge, the ones they'd already driven off. She thought about the man she'd shot, the way he'd stumbled and fallen, and the sick twist in her stomach that still hadn't gone away. And she thought about Richard Halford, sitting in some warm office hundreds of miles away, signing papers and sending men to die so he could drag her back and call it legal. Okay, she said finally. We do it. Elias nodded once, no relief or satisfaction on his face, just acceptance. We leave at first light. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay curled on her side, the blanket pulled up to her chin, staring at the rough stone wall of the shelter. Elias was awake too. She could tell by the way he breathed, slow and controlled, the way he shifted every so often like he was working through a problem in his head. Elias, she said softly. Yeah. Have you ever done this before? Set a trap like this? Silence. Then, once. Mara waited. Long time ago, Elias continued, his voice low. Different mountain, different men. They were claim jumpers trying to run me off land I'd worked for 2 years, threatened to burn me out if I didn't leave. He paused. So I made sure they couldn't. Did it work? They didn't come back. Mara closed her eyes, her chest tight. Do you regret it? Elias was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I regret that it had to happen, he said. But I don't regret staying alive. Mara turned over, looked at him in the faint glow of the dying fire. His face was shadowed, hard lines and sharp angles, but his eyes were somewhere far away. You think I'm a bad person, he said. It wasn't a question. No, Mara said. I think you're a person who's had to make bad choices. Elias looked at her then, something shifting in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, just something. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone softer, someone who'd break. I almost did. But you didn't. Mara smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Not yet, anyway. Elias held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the fire. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. Mara nodded, though she knew sleep wouldn't come. She closed her eyes anyway, listened to the wind howl through the canyon, and tried not to think about what they were about to do. They left before dawn, moving fast and quiet through the darkness. Elias led the way, his steps sure despite the lack of light. Mara followed close, her breath misting in the frozen air, her legs already aching from the cold. The pass Elias mentioned was exactly where he said it would be, a narrow gap between two towering rock faces, barely wide enough for two men to walk side by side. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, jagged and unstable, with loose scree piled at the base. Elias stopped at the entrance, studying the terrain with a critical eye. "This'll work," he said. "Rock's loose enough. Just needs the right pressure point." Mara looked up at the walls, her stomach twisting. "How do we trigger it?" Elias pointed to a section about halfway up the left wall, where a massive boulder sat wedged between two slabs of stone. "That. It's barely holding. A good shot with enough force and the whole thing'll come down. And we'll be where exactly when that happens?" "Other side of the pass. Safe." "You sure about that?" "No," Elias admitted, "but it's the best option we've got." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to say this was insane, that there had to be another way. But she looked back the way they'd come, thought about the men tracking them, and knew there wasn't. "Okay," she said. "What do you need me to do?" Elias handed her his revolver. "You're the bait." Mara's eyes widened. "Excuse me? They're looking for you, not me. You show yourself, they'll follow. Lead them into the pass, then get clear. I'll handle the rest." "And if they shoot me before I make it through?" "Don't let them." Mara stared at him, her heart pounding. "That's your plan? Don't get shot? You got a better one?" She didn't. Elias pulled the rifle off his shoulder, checked the chamber, and handed it to her. "Take this too. You'll need the range." Mara took the rifle, the weight of it familiar now, but still terrifying. "Where will you be?" "Up there." Elias pointed to a ledge about 20 feet up the right wall. "I'll have a clear shot at the boulder. Soon as you're through, I'll bring it down." "What if you miss?" "I won't." "Elias." "Mara." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady and unyielding. "I won't miss. But you need to trust me. Can you do that?" Mara looked at him, this man who'd taken her in when no one else would, who'd taught her to survive, who'd stood beside her when he had every reason to walk away. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I can." Elias nodded. Good. Now go. They're close." Mara turned and started back down the trail, her pulse hammering in her ears. She moved quickly but carefully, keeping to the open patches where she'd be visible. She didn't have to wait long. A shout echoed through the trees behind her. "There! I see her!" Mara's breath hitched. She turned, saw 3 men crashing through the snow toward her, rifles raised. "Stop!" one of them yelled. "Stop right there!" Mara ran. She bolted toward the pass, her boots pounding through the snow, her lungs burning. Behind her, the men gave chase, their voices sharp and angry. "Don't let her get away! Cut her off!" Mara didn't look back. She focused on the pass, on the narrow gap between the rocks, on getting through before they got close enough to shoot. A gunshot cracked through the air. Snow exploded 2 feet to her left. "Next one's through your back," someone shouted. Mara pushed harder, her legs screaming, her vision blurring. The entrance to the pass loomed ahead, dark and narrow. She dove through. The walls closed in around her, the light dimming, the sound of her pursuers echoing off the stone. She ran deeper, her heart in her throat, until she saw the light at the other end. She burst through into open air, stumbled, and fell to her knees in the snow. Behind her, the men entered the pass. "She's through! Move!" Mara looked up, saw Elias on the ledge above, the rifle braced against his shoulder, his eye pressed to the sight. Their eyes met for one brief second. Then he fired. The shot was perfect. The bullet struck the boulder dead center, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the rock shifted. A low grinding sound filled the air, like the mountain itself was waking up. The boulder tipped forward, slowly at first, then faster, and then it fell. It hit the scree below with a sound like thunder. The entire wall came down. Rocks the size of wagons tumbled into the pass, smashing into the narrow gap with brutal force. The men inside screamed, high, desperate sounds that cut off abruptly as the avalanche swallowed them whole. The noise was deafening. The ground shook. Dust and snow billowed up in a choking cloud that blotted out the sun. And then, slowly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Mara knelt in the snow, her hands over her ears, her body trembling. She stared at the place where the pass had been. It was gone. Buried under tons of rock and debris, sealed completely, like it had never existed. Elias climbed down from the ledge, his movements careful, and walked over to where she knelt. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the rubble. "It's done," he said quietly. Mara couldn't speak. She just stared at the rocks, her mind blank, her chest hollow. Elias crouched beside her. "Mara, look at me." She turned her head slowly, met his eyes. "They're gone," he said. "They can't hurt you anymore." Mara nodded numbly. "Yeah. You did what you had to do." "I know." "Then why do you look like that?" Mara's throat tightened. "Because I just killed 3 men." "No," Elias said firmly. "I killed them. You survived. There's a difference." Mara shook her head, her eyes burning. "I led them here. I was the bait. That makes you smart," Elias interrupted, "and brave, and alive." He reached out, gripped her shoulder. "Don't carry their weight, Mara. They chose to follow you. They chose to hunt you. This is on them, not you." Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to let go of the sick, heavy feeling sitting in her stomach like a stone, but she couldn't, not yet. Elias stood, offered her his hand. "Come on. We need to move before anyone else shows up." Mara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs felt weak, her body drained, but she forced herself to walk. They left the pass behind, climbing higher into the mountains, putting distance between themselves and the rock slide. Mara didn't look back. She couldn't. They walked for hours in silence. The sun climbed higher, then began to sink again, casting long shadows across the snow. Mara's mind was numb, her thoughts scattered, but her body kept moving. Finally, as the light started to fade, Elias stopped at the edge of a frozen lake. "We'll camp here," he said. "It's exposed, but we'll see anyone coming from a mile out." Mara nodded, too tired to argue. She dropped her pack, sat down on a fallen log, and stared out at the lake. The surface was smooth and white, untouched, like glass. Elias built a small fire, rationed out what little food they had left, and sat across from her. They ate in silence. When the food was gone, Elias leaned back, his eyes on the sky. "We need to go back." Mara looked at him sharply. "Back where?" "To town. To the cabin. Somewhere with supplies." He gestured to their nearly empty packs. "We're running out, and winter's not even halfway done." "We can't go back," Mara said. "Halford's men are buried under a mountain," Elias finished. "And the ones who got away won't come back without reinforcements. That'll take time. Maybe weeks. Maybe longer. Or maybe they're already waiting for us." "Maybe," Elias admitted. "But we don't have a choice. We stay out here much longer, we'll starve. Or freeze. Or both." Mara wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping through her coat. "What if Halford's there? What if he came himself? Then we deal with him." "How?" Elias met her eyes, his expression hard. "However we have to." Mara looked away, her mind racing. She knew he was right. They couldn't survive out here indefinitely. But the thought of going back, of walking into a trap, made her stomach twist. "What if I turn myself in?" she said quietly. Elias's head snapped toward her. "What?" "What if I go to the law, tell them the truth about Halford, about what he did?" "They won't listen," Elias said flatly. "He's got money, power, lawyers who'll twist everything you say until you're the criminal and he's the victim. You walk into a courthouse, you'll walk out in chains." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Elias stood, his jaw tight. "I've seen it happen. Men like Halford don't lose in court. They buy the judge, they buy the jury, and they buy the truth. The only way you beat someone like that is by making sure he can't reach you." "And how do we do that?" Mara asked, her voice rising. "Keep running? Keep killing anyone he sends? Live in the mountains until we die?" "If that's what it takes." Mara stood too, her fists clenched. "That's not a life, Elias. That's just—" "It's survival," Elias snapped. "And survival's all we've got." They stared at each other, the fire crackling between them, their breath misting in the cold air. Then Elias turned away, ran a hand through his hair, and let out a long, slow breath. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I can't lose this." Mara blinked. "Lose what?" Elias looked at her, his face raw in the firelight. "You." Mara's breath caught. "I spent 10 years alone," Elias continued, his voice rough. 10 years with nothing but snow and silence and the same 4 walls. I thought that's all I'd ever have. And then you showed up, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I had a reason to want more than just getting through the day. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "So no, I won't let Halford take you. I won't let anyone take you, because you're mine now, and I protect what's mine." Mara stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the sudden rush of emotion sitting heavy in her chest, so she crossed the distance between them and kissed him. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle, it was desperate and messy and tasted like fear and relief and something neither of them had words for. Elias froze for half a second, then his arms came around her, pulling her close, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Mara rested her forehead against his. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Elias's hand came up, cupped the side of her face. "Promise me." "I promise." They stood there for a long moment, the fire burning low, the cold pressing in from all sides. Then Elias stepped back, his hand sliding down to grip hers. "We'll go back tomorrow," he said. "But we do it smart. We scout first, we stay hidden, and if Halford's there, we don't engage, we watch, we wait, and when the time's right, we end it." Mara nodded, her fingers tightening around his. "Together." "Together," Elias agreed. They sat back down by the fire, closer this time, and Mara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if they'd make it back alive. But for the first time since this whole nightmare started, she wasn't afraid, because she wasn't alone, and neither was he. The next morning, they broke camp before sunrise and started the long trek back toward the cabin. The journey took 2 full days, moving carefully, avoiding open trails, staying out of sight. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Elias stopped and pulled out a small brass spyglass. He scanned the area below, his face tense. "What do you see?" Mara asked. "Horses," Elias said. 4 of them, tied up outside the cabin. Mara's stomach dropped. "He's here." "Maybe. Or it's more hired guns." Elias lowered the spyglass, his jaw tight. "Either way, we're not going down there blind." They waited until dark, then crept down the slope, moving through the trees like shadows. The cabin windows glowed with firelight, and voices drifted out into the night, low, male, confident. Elias and Mara circled around to the back, staying low. Elias peered through a gap in the shutters, then pulled back and motioned for Mara to look. She pressed her eye to the gap and saw 4 men inside. 3 of them were rough-looking, armed, clearly hired muscle. The 4th was different, older, well-dressed, clean-shaven, sitting at Elias's table like he owned the place. Richard Halford. Mara's blood went cold. Elias pulled her back, his hand firm on her arm. "We can't take 4 of them head-on," he whispered, "not without getting killed." "So what do we do?" Elias thought for a moment, his eyes hard. Then he looked at the horses tied near the front of the cabin. "We cut them loose," he said. "They panic. The men come out to check. We pick them off one by one." "And Halford?" Elias's expression went dark. "We save him for last." Mara nodded, her heart pounding. They moved quietly toward the horses. Elias pulled his knife, cut the first rope, then the second. The horses shifted, nervous. Mara untied the third, then slapped it hard on the rump. The horse bolted. The others followed, scattering into the darkness with loud, panicked whinnies. Inside the cabin, someone shouted. The door burst open, and 2 of the hired men stumbled out, cursing. Elias shot the first one before he even cleared the doorway. Mara raised her rifle and fired at the second. He went down hard, clutching his chest. The 3rd man dove back inside, slammed the door, and started yelling. Elias reloaded, his movements fast and practiced. "They're pinned, but they'll try to make a run for it." "Let them," Mara said coldly, "as long as Halford stays inside." They waited. Minutes passed, then the back window shattered, and the third man tried to climb through. Elias shot him mid-crawl. Silence fell. Then, from inside, a voice called out, smooth, calm. "Miss Vance, I know you're out there." Mara's jaw clenched. "Let's be reasonable about this," Halford continued. "You've made your point. Now let's talk like civilized people." Elias looked at Mara. "Your call." Mara stared at the cabin, her hands shaking with something that wasn't fear. It was rage. "Burn it," she said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Burn it." Elias nodded slowly, then moved to the woodpile, grabbed a torch, and lit it from the coals of an old fire pit. He walked to the cabin, looked back at Mara one last time. She nodded. Elias threw the torch onto the roof. The dry wood caught instantly, flames spreading fast and hungry. Inside, Halford started screaming. The front door flew open and he stumbled out, coughing, his fine coat singed. Mara stepped into the firelight, rifle raised. Halford froze. "Mara," he said, his voice strained. "Please, we can work this out." "No," Mara said. "We can't." And she pulled the trigger. The shot missed. Not by much. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Halford's coat, close enough that he felt the heat. But it missed. Mara's hands were shaking too hard. The rifle barrel wavered, her finger frozen on the trigger, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Halford stumbled backward, his eyes wide, his hands raised. "Mara, wait." "Shut up," Mara hissed, but her voice cracked. She tried to steady the rifle, tried to line up another shot, but her whole body was trembling now. Elias appeared beside her, his hand closing over the barrel, gently pushing it down. "Not like this," he said quietly. Mara's eyes snapped to his. "He has to die." "I know, but not like this." Behind them, the cabin groaned as flames consumed the roof. Sparks spiraled into the night sky, and the heat pressed against their backs like a hand shoving them forward. Halford took another step back, his face pale in the firelight. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice shaking but still trying for control. "Killing me won't solve anything. There are legal documents, witnesses, people who know I came here." "Let them know," Elias said flatly. "Won't matter much when you're dead." Halford's jaw tightened. "I have connections. Lawyers. Men who'll come looking if I don't return." "Then they'll find a body," Elias said, "and nothing else." Halford looked between them, his confidence cracking. "You think you can just murder me and walk away? The law will hunt you down. Both of you." "The law didn't stop you from stealing her life," Mara said, her voice steadier now. "So I don't care what the law thinks." Halford opened his mouth, closed it, then tried a different approach. His voice softened, turned almost gentle. "Mara, listen to me. I never wanted it to be this way. Your father's debts were paid off 6 months before he died," Mara cut in. "I found the receipts, hidden in his desk, stamped and signed by your bank." Halford went still. "You fabricated the debt," Mara continued, her voice cold. "You forged documents. You used the law to steal everything my family had, and when I wouldn't marry you, you sent men to drag me back like property." "That's not—" "Don't," Mara snapped. "Don't lie to me. Not now." Halford's face hardened, the mask slipped, and what showed underneath was ugly. "You think you're the first woman to owe me something? You think you're special?" He laughed, sharp and bitter. "Your father gambled everything away before the debt even existed. I gave you a way out, a comfortable life, and you spat in my face." "I said no," Mara said. "That should have been enough." "No is never enough," Halford sneered. "Not for women like you. You needed to be taught." Elias moved. One step forward, fast and silent, and his fist connected with Halford's jaw. The older man went down hard, hitting the snow with a grunt. Blood trickled from his split lip, and he looked up at Elias with something close to fear. Elias stood over him, his face calm, his voice quiet. "You're done talking." Halford spat blood into the snow. "You're going to regret this." "Probably," Elias said, "but not as much as you will." He grabbed Halford by the collar, hauled him to his feet, and shoved him toward the trees. "Walk." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere quiet." Halford tried to resist, but Elias's grip was iron. Mara followed, the rifle still in her hands, her heart pounding. They walked for 10 minutes, moving away from the burning cabin, deeper into the dark. The snow crunched under their boots, and the only other sound was Halford's ragged breathing. Finally, Elias stopped in a small clearing. He pushed Halford down onto a fallen log and stepped back. "Sit," he said, "and don't move." Halford sat, his hands shaking, his eyes darting between them. "What are you going to do?" Elias didn't answer. He turned to Mara. "Your call." Mara looked at Halford, at the man who'd stolen her home, her freedom, her future. The man who'd hunted her across state lines and sent armed men to drag her back. And she realized something. She didn't want to kill him. Not because he didn't deserve it. He did. But because killing him wouldn't undo what he'd done. It wouldn't give her back what she'd lost. And more than that, she didn't want to become the kind of person who could pull that trigger without hesitation. "Elias," she said quietly, "I can't." Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You sure?" "Yeah." Elias nodded slowly, then he turned to Halford. "You're lucky." Halford let out a shaky breath. "So you're letting me go?" "No," Elias said. "You're going to walk back to town. You're going to tell whoever asks that you came up here looking for Mara Vance, and you didn't find her. You're going to drop the charges, burn the documents, and forget she exists." Halford's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't? Then I'll find you," Elias said simply. "And next time, Mara won't be here to stop me." Halford stared at him, and whatever he saw in Elias's face made him go pale. "You think I'm bluffing," Elias continued, his voice flat. "I'm not. You've seen what I can do. You've lost 3 men already, maybe more. And I know where you live. I know where you work. I know the route you take home every night." He leaned in close. "So you're going to walk away, and you're going to stay away. Because if you don't, I won't kill you fast. I'll make it slow, and I'll make sure you feel every second of it." Halford's breath hitched. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then finally he nodded. "Good," Elias said. He stepped back, gestured toward the trees. "Go, now, before I change my mind." Halford stood on shaking legs, looked at Mara one last time, then turned and stumbled into the darkness. They watched him go, his figure disappearing into the trees, the sound of his footsteps fading. Mara lowered the rifle, her hands still trembling. "You think he'll actually leave us alone?" "No," Elias said honestly, "but he'll think twice before coming back." Mara let out a long, shaky breath. "So what now?" Elias looked back toward the cabin, or what was left of it. The flames were dying down now, leaving only glowing embers and blackened timber. "Now," he said, "we go to town." Mara blinked. "What?" "We go to town," Elias repeated. "We find a lawyer. We tell the truth. We get ahead of whatever story Halford's going to spin. Elias, he's got money, connections. They'll believe him over us." "Maybe," Elias said, "but maybe not. You said you found receipts, proof the debt was paid." "I did, but they're—" Mara stopped, her eyes widening. "They're in the cabin." Elias grimaced. "Yeah, I figured." Mara cursed under her breath. "So we've got nothing. We've got your word, and mine. That's not enough." "It's a start." Mara wanted to argue, but she was too tired, too drained. She just nodded and followed Elias back through the trees. The cabin was still smoldering when they reached it. The roof had collapsed, and most of the walls were gone. Everything inside was ash. Mara stood at the edge of the wreckage, staring at what was left of the place she'd started to think of as home. Elias walked to the remains of the woodpile, salvaged a few unburned logs, and started building a fire a safe distance away. "We'll rest here tonight," he said. "Head to town in the morning." Mara sat down beside him, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared into the flames. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Elias glanced at her. "For what?" "For burning down your home." Elias shook his head. "It's just wood. We can rebuild." "Can we?" Elias looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "Yeah, we can." Mara wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart faster than they could hold it together. They slept poorly that night, huddled close to the fire, taking turns keeping watch. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, they packed what little they had and started the long walk to town. The journey took most of the day. By the time they reached the outskirts, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Mara hesitated at the edge of town, her stomach twisting. The last time she'd been here, she'd slapped a man in front of half the population. She didn't know what kind of reception she'd get now. Elias seemed to sense her hesitation. "Stay close," he said, "and let me do the talking." They walked down the main street, and slowly, people started to notice. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-stroke, her eyes widening. A man leaning against a post straightened, his mouth falling open. Whispers started, spreading like wildfire. "That's her. Crow's wife. Thought she was dead." Elias ignored them. He walked straight to the sheriff's office, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a graying mustache, looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing. "Crow," he said slowly. "Didn't expect to see you." "We need to talk," Elias said. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Mara. "This about her?" "Yeah." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression wary. "Heard some men went up your way. Didn't come back." "They didn't," Elias said bluntly. "You kill them?" "They came looking for a fight. They got one." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That's murder, Crow." "That's self-defense," Elias corrected. "They were armed. They were trespassing. And they fired first." "You got proof of that?" "I got a dead man's rifle with his fingerprints on it," Elias said. "And I got a witness." He gestured to Mara. "Her." The sheriff looked at Mara for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." So Mara told him. She told him about her father's death, about Halford's forged documents, about the men he'd sent. She told him about the cabin, the chase, the rock slide, the burning. The sheriff listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "That's a hell of a story." "It's the truth," Mara said. "Maybe. But truth and proof aren't always the same thing." "I had proof," Mara said. "Receipts showing the debt was paid, but they burned in the fire." The sheriff frowned. "Convenient?" "It's not convenient," Mara snapped. "It's what happened." "Easy," Elias said quietly, his hand on her arm. The sheriff studied them both, then stood. "Wait here." He left the office, and Mara looked at Elias, her heart sinking. "He doesn't believe us." "He's a lawman," Elias said. "He's not supposed to believe anyone until he's got evidence." "We don't have evidence." "Not yet." The sheriff returned 20 minutes later, holding a folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk and looked at Mara. "I sent a wire to the county clerk's office where your father lived," he said. "Asked about the debt records." Mara's breath caught. And they found something interesting." He unfolded the paper, scanned it, then looked up. "There's 2 sets of records. One showing your father owed Richard Halford a significant sum at the time of his death, and another filed 3 months earlier, showing the debt was paid in full." Mara's heart leaped. "So I was right." "Maybe," the sheriff said. "Or maybe someone made a clerical error. Or maybe Halford forged the second set of documents to cover his tracks," Elias said. The sheriff didn't argue. He just folded the paper and slid it into his desk drawer. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, you two stay out of trouble." "That's it?" Mara asked, her voice rising. "That's all you're going to do?" "That's all I can do without more evidence," the sheriff said. "If Halford comes back, I'll question him. But until then, my hands are tied." Mara wanted to scream, wanted to throw something. But Elias's hand tightened on her arm and she forced herself to stay calm. "Thank you," Elias said quietly. The sheriff nodded. "You're welcome. Now get out of my office before I change my mind about arresting you both." They left. Outside, the sun had set, and the street was dark except for the glow of lanterns and windows. Mara stood on the boardwalk, her hands clenched into fists, her whole body shaking with frustration. "He's not going to do anything," she said. "He might," Elias said. "Give him time." "I don't have time," Mara snapped. "Halford's out there right now, probably halfway back to wherever he came from, and the sheriff's just going to let him walk away." "Maybe, but we planted a seed, and seeds take time to grow." Mara turned to him, her eyes burning. "I don't want seeds, Elias. I want justice. I know, Elias said quietly. But justice doesn't always look the way you want it to. Mara looked away, her throat tight. A voice called out from down the street. Mara Vance? Mara turned. A woman was walking toward them, middle-aged, dressed in a plain wool coat, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Yes? Mara said warily. The woman stopped a few feet away, her eyes sharp and assessing. My name is Clara Winters. I'm a lawyer. Mara blinked. A lawyer? That's right. Clara glanced at Elias, then back at Mara. I heard you were in town. Heard you've been having trouble with Richard Halford. Mara's pulse quickened. How do you know about that? Because you're not the first woman he's done this to, Clara said bluntly. And I've been trying to build a case against him for 2 years. Mara stared at her. What? Clara pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, flipped it open, and scanned the pages. 3 women, all with similar stories, fathers or husbands who died with outstanding debts. Debts that Halford claimed and then used as leverage to force marriage or seize property. Why didn't they come forward, Mara asked. They did, Clara said grimly. But Halford's lawyers buried them under paperwork, intimidation, and legal fees they couldn't afford. 2 of them gave up. 1 disappeared. Mara's stomach turned. Disappeared. No body, no witnesses, just gone. Clara closed the notebook and looked Mara in the eye. But you're still here, and from what I've heard, you've got a spine made of iron. Mara didn't know what to say. Clara stepped closer. I want to help you, but I need you to help me. I need your testimony. I need details. Dates, names, anything you can remember about Halford's dealings with your father. I already told the sheriff. The sheriff can't do anything without a prosecutor willing to file charges, Clara interrupted. But I can file a civil suit. I can drag Halford into court, put him on the stand, and make him answer for what he's done. If we win, we can force him to return what he stole, from you and from the others. Mara's heart was pounding now. And if we lose? Then we lose, Clara said simply. But at least we tried. Mara looked at Elias. He nodded once. She turned back to Clara. Okay, I'll do it. Clara smiled. A small, grim smile that didn't reach her eyes. Good. Come to my office tomorrow morning. We'll go through everything step by step. She handed Mara a card with an address, then walked away, her heels clicking on the wooden boardwalk. Mara stared at the card, her hands shaking. Elias put his arm around her shoulders. You did good. I haven't done anything yet, Mara said. You're still standing, Elias said. That's more than most. Mara leaned into him, her eyes closed, and for the first time in days, she let herself breathe. They found a boarding house at the edge of town, a small, run-down place that didn't ask questions as long as they paid up front. The room was barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was warm, and it had a lock on the door. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked plaster wall, while Elias checked the window and the door. You think she's for real? Mara asked. The lawyer? I think she's got her own reasons for going after Halford, Elias said. But that doesn't mean she's lying. What if it's a trap? Then we walk away. Mara nodded, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. Elias sat down beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. You don't have to do this, you know. We could leave tonight, head north, disappear, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? Better than spending it in a courtroom. Mara looked at him, saw the worry in his eyes, and shook her head. I'm tired of running, Elias. I'm tired of hiding. If there's even a chance I can stop him, really stop him, I have to try. Elias held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Then we do it together. Mara's throat tightened. You don't have to. I know, Elias said. But I'm going to anyway. Mara reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his, and held on tight. They sat there in silence, the cheap lantern flickering on the table, the sounds of the town muffled through the thin walls. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara let herself hope. Not that everything would be okay. Not that they'd win. Just that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. The next morning, they met Clara Winters at her office, a narrow, cluttered room above a dry goods store. Papers were stacked everywhere, Law books lined the walls, and a single desk sat in the center, covered in ink stains and coffee rings. Clara didn't waste time on pleasantries. She sat Mara down, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and started asking questions. When did your father die? April 14th, 2 years ago. And when did Halford first approach you? 2 days later. What did he say? Mara recounted the conversation as best she could remember. Clara wrote everything down, her pen scratching across the paper in quick, precise strokes. And the debt? How much did he claim your father owed? $5,000. Clara's eyebrows rose. That's a significant sum. My father liked to gamble, Mara said quietly. But he wasn't stupid. He knew when to stop. And you're certain the debt was paid? I saw the receipts, signed and stamped by Halford's own bank. Clara made a note. Do you remember the date on the receipts? Mara closed her eyes, tried to picture them. January 9th, 6 months before he died. Clara nodded, wrote it down. And where are the receipts now? Burned, Mara said bitterly. In the cabin fire. Clara frowned but didn't comment. She just kept writing. They went through everything. The forged documents, the men Halford sent, the chase, the rock slide. Clara didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. She just listened and took notes. When Mara finished, Clara set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. All right, she said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to file a civil suit against Richard Halford for fraud, coercion, and wrongful seizure of property. I'm also going to subpoena his financial records and request an audit of the debt documents he filed with the court. Will that work? Mara asked. It'll get his attention, Clara said, and it'll force him to respond. If he's smart, he'll settle out of court. If he's not, we'll drag him in front of a judge and make him explain the discrepancies. And if he has the judge in his pocket, Clara smiled thinly, then we appeal. And we keep appealing until we find one who isn't. Mara looked at Elias. He nodded. Okay, Mara said. Let's do it. Clara stood, extended her hand. Welcome to the fight, Mrs. Crow. Mara shook her hand, the weight of the moment settling over her like a cloak. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting back. And this time, she wasn't going to lose. The lawsuit hit Halford 3 weeks later. Mara wasn't there when the papers were served, but Clara described it to her afterward with something close to satisfaction in her voice. Halford had been at a restaurant, dining with 2 of his business associates, when the process server walked up to his table and handed him the summons. He'd gone pale, Clara said, then red. Then he'd crumpled the papers in his fist and stormed out without paying his bill. Mara tried to feel triumphant, tried to imagine his rage and taste some kind of victory in it. But all she felt was tired. The waiting was the worst part. Claire had warned her it would take time, weeks, maybe months, before they'd see the inside of a courtroom. In the meantime, Halford's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to get the case dismissed, trying to bury them in paperwork and delays. Clara fought back with a ferocity that surprised Mara. She matched every filing with one of her own, requested document after document, and slowly began to build a case that even Halford's expensive attorneys couldn't ignore. But it was exhausting and expensive, and Mara didn't have money. What she had was Elias. He found work in town, carpentry mostly, fixing roofs and building fences for people who didn't ask too many questions. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the boarding house and put food on the table. Mara found work too, cleaning houses for families who needed the help and didn't mind hiring a woman with a reputation. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to matter. But it kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, and that was something. At night, they'd sit in their small room, eating whatever cheap meal they'd managed to scrape together, and Clara would go over the case with them. She'd spread papers across the bed, pointing out inconsistencies in Halford's financial records, highlighting dates that didn't line up, showing them the slow, methodical process of building a legal trap. He's getting nervous, Clara said one evening, tapping a finger on a letter from Halford's attorney. They're offering to settle. Mara looked up sharply. For how much? $2,000. An assigned agreement that you'll drop all claims and never speak publicly about the case. Mara's jaw tightened. He stole $5,000. And my home. And 2 years of my life. I know, Clara said, but $2,000 is more than most people get, and it's guaranteed. If we go to trial, we could lose everything. Or we could win, Mara said. Clara studied her for a long moment. You're sure you want to risk it? Mara looked at Elias. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. What do you think? She asked him. Elias shrugged. I think it's your choice, but I also think Halford wouldn't be offering money if he thought he could win. Mara turned back to Clara. Tell him no. Clara smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. She packed up her papers, promised to send a response in the morning, and left. Mara stood at the window, staring out at the darkening street, her arms wrapped around herself. Elias came up behind her, his hand settling on her shoulder. You okay? I don't know, Mara admitted. I keep thinking about what happens if we lose, if the judge sides with him, if we end up with nothing. Then we end up with nothing, Elias said. But at least we tried. Mara turned to face him. You don't have to stay, you know. You could go back to the mountains, rebuild the cabin, live the way you did before. Elias looked at her like she'd said something absurd. You think I want to go back to that? I think it was simpler. Simpler's not the same as better. Mara's throat tightened. I'm scared, Elias. I know. What if this doesn't work? What if we go through all of this and nothing changes? Elias cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes steady. Then we figure out what's next. Together. Mara leaned into him, closed her eyes, and let herself believe it. The trial was set for early March, nearly 4 months after Clara first filed the suit. By the time the date arrived, winter had loosened its grip on the mountains, and the first signs of spring were starting to show. Patches of brown earth visible through the melting snow, birds returning to the trees, the air losing its sharp, cutting edge. Mara barely noticed. She was too focused on the courtroom. It was smaller than she'd expected. A plain room with wooden benches, a judge's desk at the front, and windows that let in pale morning light. A handful of spectators sat in the back, curious townspeople who'd heard about the case and wanted to see how it played out. Halford sat at the defendant's table with his 2 lawyers, both of them dressed in expensive suits, their faces calm and confident. Halford himself looked older than Mara remembered, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, and a tightness around his mouth that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Good, Mara thought viciously. Clara sat beside Mara at the plaintiff's table, her own stack of papers neatly organized, her expression focused. Elias sat in the front row directly behind them, his presence solid and reassuring. The judge entered, a severe-looking woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Everyone stood, then sat again as she took her seat. This is a civil suit filed by Mara Vance against Richard Halford, the judge said, her voice crisp. Allegations include fraud, coercion, and wrongful seizure of property. Counselor Winters, you may proceed. Clara stood, smoothed her skirt, and began. She laid out the case methodically, piece by piece. She presented the conflicting debt records, the original showing the debt paid in full, the second showing it outstanding. She brought forward testimony from the county clerk who'd filed the documents, who confirmed under oath that 2 sets of records existed and that the second set bore signs of alteration. Halford's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled them each time. Clara called witnesses, people who'd known Mara's father, who confirmed he'd been careful with money in his final months, who testified that he'd spoken about settling his debts before he died. She called the banker who'd processed the original payment, an elderly man who brought his own records and confirmed the transaction. And then she called Mara. Mara's hands were shaking as she walked to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Clara approached slowly, her expression kind. Mrs. Crow, can you tell the court about the first time you met Richard Halford? Mara took a breath, steadied herself, and began. She told them everything. The way Halford had shown up at her door 2 days after her father's funeral, the way he'd smiled and called himself generous, the way he'd cornered her, threatened her, used the law to steal everything she had. She told them about the forged documents, about the men he'd sent to drag her back, about the terror of running and the desperation of not knowing where to go. And she told them about the receipts she'd found, proof that her father had paid his debts, proof that Halford had lied. Halford's lead attorney stood when Mara finished, his expression skeptical. Mrs. Crow, you claim these receipts existed, but you don't have them, do you? They burned in a fire, Mara said. How convenient. It wasn't convenient, Mara snapped. It was arson. Your client's men set the fire. Allegedly, the lawyer said smoothly. You have no proof of that. I have 3 dead men who came to my home armed and looking for me, Mara shot back. What more proof do you need? The lawyer's smile thinned. Dead men tell no tales, Mrs. Crow. And without physical evidence, your claims are just that. Claims. Clara stood. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said. Move on, counselor. The lawyer tried a different angle. Mrs. Crow, isn't it true that you left your home voluntarily, that you ran because you didn't want to face your legal obligations? I left because staying meant marrying a man who bought me like property, Mara said, her voice shaking with anger. That's not a legal obligation. That's extortion. That's a matter of interpretation. No, Mara said firmly. That's the truth. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge cut him off. That's enough. Step down, Mrs. Crow. Mara returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Clara gave her a small nod, and Elias reached forward, squeezed her shoulder briefly. The trial continued for 2 more days. Halford took the stand and denied everything, his voice smooth and practiced. He claimed the debt was real, that the receipts Mara described never existed, that he'd only been trying to help a young woman in distress. Clara tore him apart. She presented the altered records, forced him to explain the discrepancies, pointed out the dates that didn't match, the signatures that looked forged. She brought forward 2 of the other women Halford had targeted, women who'd been too afraid to speak before but found their courage when they saw Mara fighting. Their stories were nearly identical to Mara's. Debts that appeared after deaths, pressure to marry, threats when they refused. By the time Clara finished, Halford's confident mask had cracked. He looked rattled, defensive, and his lawyers were scrambling. On the 3rd day, the judge called for closing arguments. Clara stood, her voice steady and strong. Your Honor, this case is about more than money. It's about a man who used his wealth and power to prey on vulnerable women, who twisted the law to suit his purposes, who believed he could do whatever he wanted because no one would stop him. She turned to look at Halford. But Mara Vance stopped him. She fought back. And now she's asking this court to hold him accountable, not just for what he took from her, but for what he's taken from others. The evidence is clear. The pattern is undeniable. Richard Halford is guilty, and it's time he paid for it. Halford's lawyer stood next, his tone dismissive. Your Honor, this entire case rests on allegations without proof. Mrs. Crow claims documents existed that she cannot produce. She claims harassment without witnesses. She claims fraud based on records that could just as easily be explained by clerical error. The defense asks that you dismiss this case for lack of evidence and allow Mr. Halford to move on with his life. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. I'll take this under advisement, she said. Court is adjourned. I'll issue my ruling in 1 week. The courtroom emptied slowly. Mara stood on shaking legs, her whole body drained. Clara packed up her papers, her face calm but unreadable. We did everything we could, she said quietly. Is it enough? Mara asked. I don't know, Clara admitted, but we'll find out soon. That week was the longest of Mara's life. She tried to work, tried to keep herself busy, but her mind kept circling back to the courtroom, replaying every word, every argument, every look on the judge's face. Elias stayed close, steady as always. He didn't offer false reassurances or empty platitudes. He just stayed, and that was enough. On the 7th day, they returned to the courtroom. The judge entered, took her seat, and opened a folder on her desk. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony presented in this case, she said, and I've reached a decision. Mara's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mara Vance. Mara's breath left her in a rush. Beside her, Clara exhaled slowly, relief flickering across her face. The judge continued. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates a pattern of fraudulent conduct by the defendant, Richard Halford. The altered debt records, combined with testimony from multiple witnesses, established that Mr. Halford knowingly and willfully misrepresented the financial obligations of the deceased and used those misrepresentations to coerce the plaintiff into an unlawful agreement. Halford's face had gone ashen. The court orders Mr. Halford to pay restitution in the amount of $7,000 to Mrs. Vance, representing the original debt claimed, plus damages for emotional distress and loss of property. Additionally, the court orders Mr. Halford to publicly retract all claims against Mrs. Vance and to cease any further contact or harassment. The judge's eyes hardened. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. Fraud is a serious crime, Mr. Halford, and this court will not tolerate it. She brought her gavel down with a sharp crack. Case closed. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mara sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Clara turned to her, a rare smile on her face. We won. Mara nodded numbly. We won. Elias leaned forward, his hand on her shoulder. You did it. Mara turned to look at him, and suddenly the enormity of it hit her. She'd won. Not just the case, not just the money. She'd won her freedom, her name, her future. And for the first time in 2 years, she could breathe without fear sitting heavy on her chest. Halford stood abruptly, his face twisted with rage. He started to say something, but his lawyers grabbed his arms and hustled him out of the courtroom before he could make things worse. Mara watched him go and felt nothing. No triumph, no anger, just relief. Outside the courthouse, the spring air was warm and bright. Mara stood on the steps, blinking in the sunlight, still trying to wrap her mind around what had just happened. Clara shook her hand, promised to handle the paperwork for the restitution, and left with a brisk nod. Elias stood beside Mara, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. So, he said, what now? Mara looked at him, then at the town spread out below them, then at the mountains rising in the distance. Now, she said slowly, we go home. Elias raised an eyebrow. The cabin's still just a pile of ash. Then we rebuild it. That'll take time. We've got time. Elias studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yeah, he said. We do. They left town the next day, their pockets heavier with the first installment of the restitution payment, their packs stocked with supplies. The journey back to the mountains felt different this time, lighter, like they were walking towards something instead of away from it. When they reached the clearing where the cabin had stood, Mara stopped and looked at the charred remains. The roof was gone, the walls collapsed, but the stone foundation was still there, solid, unbroken, waiting. Elias set down his pack and walked the perimeter, assessing the damage. We'll need to clear the debris first, he said. Then we can start framing. Mara nodded, rolling up her sleeves. Where do we start? Elias handed her a pair of work gloves. Here. They worked through the day, hauling away burned timber, sorting through the wreckage for anything salvageable. It was hard, dirty work, and Mara's hands ached by the time the sun started to set. But it felt good. It felt like building something, like claiming something, like home. That night, they camped in the clearing, their fire crackling in the spot where the hearth used to be. Mara sat close to Elias, her head resting on his shoulder, watching the flames dance. You ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't answered that ad? Elias asked quietly. Mara considered it. Sometimes, but not in a good way. What do you mean? I mean, I think about where I'd be if I hadn't run, if I'd stayed and married Halford just to survive. She paused. I'd have a roof over my head, food, security, but I wouldn't have me. Elias looked at her. You would have lost yourself. Yeah. And now? Mara smiled faintly. Now I know who I am, and I know what I'm capable of, and I know that no one, no man, no law, no amount of money gets to take that away from me ever again. Elias was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'm glad you answered the ad. Mara turned to look at him. Yeah? Yeah. Because you didn't just survive, Mara. You changed everything, for both of us. Mara's throat tightened. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and soft, and when they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. I love you, she said. The words felt strange and new, but they also felt true. Elias's hand came up to cup her face. I love you too. They sat there in the firelight, holding each other, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara felt whole. The cabin took 3 months to rebuild. They worked every day, from sunrise to sunset, cutting timber, fitting logs, raising walls. Elias taught Mara how to notch the wood, how to seal the gaps with moss and clay, how to build a roof that wouldn't collapse under the weight of snow. Mara's hands grew calloused and strong. Her muscles ached constantly, but she didn't mind. Every beam they raised, every board they nailed was proof that she was still here, still standing, still fighting. Neighbors from town came up occasionally, curious or helpful. The shopkeeper brought nails and tar paper. The young man from the livery brought a wagon load of supplies and stayed for 2 days to help with the framing. Even the sheriff rode up once, ostensibly to check on them, but he ended up helping them hoist the ridgepole into place. "You've got half the town talking," he said, as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "Most folks didn't think you'd come back." "Most folks don't know me," Mara said. The sheriff chuckled. "No, I suppose they don't." By the time summer arrived in full, the cabin was finished. It wasn't fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a stone fireplace, and a door that locked, but it was theirs. Mara stood in the doorway on the first night, looking out at the clearing bathed in twilight, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. Elias came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," Mara said slowly, "that I spent so long running that I forgot what it felt like to stay. And now? Now I'm staying." Elias tightened his hold on her. "Good, because I'm not letting you go." Mara turned in his arms, looked up at him, and smiled. "I wouldn't let you if you tried." They stood there for a long time, wrapped up in each other, as the stars began to appear overhead and the forest settled into its nightly rhythm. And Mara realized something. She wasn't defined by what had been taken from her. She wasn't defined by the men who'd tried to break her or the fear that had chased her across state lines. She was defined by what she'd built in the aftermath, by the choices she'd made, by the strength she'd found when she thought she had none left. She'd been a daughter who lost her father, a woman who lost her home, a fugitive who lost her freedom, but she was also a survivor, a fighter, a wife, and she was free. The restitution money came in installments over the next year. Mara used part of it to buy the land the cabin sat on, making it officially hers. No debts, no liens, no one who could take it away. The rest she saved, tucked away in a small lockbox under the floorboards for emergencies she hoped would never come. Clara Winters wrote to her occasionally, updating her on Halford's case. The district attorney had filed criminal charges: fraud, extortion, coercion. The trial was slow, dragged out by expensive lawyers and endless motions, but Clara was confident he'd be convicted. Mara didn't attend the trial. She didn't need to. She'd already won the only fight that mattered. 1 year after the cabin was rebuilt, Mara found out she was pregnant. She told Elias on a cold November evening, sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Elias stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he smiled, broad and bright and full of something Mara had never seen in him before. Hope. "You sure?" he asked. Mara nodded. "Pretty sure?" Elias set down his own cup, crossed to where she sat, and pulled her into his arms. "We're going to have a baby," he said, like he was testing the words. "Yeah," Mara said, her voice shaking slightly. "We are." Elias pulled back, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright. "We're going to need a bigger cabin," he said. Mara laughed, the sound light and free. "We'll manage." And they did. They added a second room before the baby came, a small space with a window that faced east, so the morning light would wake the child gently. Elias built a cradle from pine, carved and sanded until it was smooth as glass. Mara sewed blankets and clothes from fabric she bought in town, her stitches careful and even. When their daughter was born in early spring, Mara held her for the first time and felt something break open inside her chest, something warm and terrifying and impossibly beautiful. Elias sat beside her on the bed, his hand on Mara's shoulder, his eyes on the baby's face. "What do we call her?" he asked quietly. Mara looked down at the tiny, perfect face, at the dark hair and the eyes that hadn't yet decided what color they'd be. "Hope," she said. Elias nodded slowly. "Hope Crow." "Hope Crow," Mara repeated, and it felt right. The years that followed weren't easy. There were hard winters and lean summers, illnesses and injuries, storms that tested the strength of the cabin and their resolve. But they endured. Mara taught Hope to read using books borrowed from the town library. Elias taught her to shoot, to track, to move through the forest like she belonged there. Together, they taught her to be strong, to be kind, to fight for what mattered and let go of what didn't. And when Hope was old enough to ask, Mara told her the truth. She told her about Richard Halford, about the men who'd chased them, about the rock slide and the fire and the courtroom where Mara had stood up and said no. Hope listened, her young face serious, and when Mara finished, she asked, "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Mara admitted. "But you did it anyway." "Yeah, I did." Hope thought about that for a moment. "Why?" Mara looked at her daughter, at the strong, curious girl she was becoming, and smiled. "Because some things are worth being scared for," she said. "And freedom is one of them." Hope nodded, satisfied, and went back to playing. And Mara watched her, her heart full, and thought about how far they'd come. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first stepped off that stagecoach, exhausted, desperate, broken, and she thought about the woman she was now, scarred, yes, but whole, stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. She'd learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about deciding what kind of life was worth living and then fighting like hell to build it. She'd learned that strength didn't mean never being afraid. It meant being afraid and moving forward anyway. She'd learned that freedom wasn't something you were given. It was something you claimed, something you defended, something you built with your own two hands, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. And she'd learned that love, real love, the kind that lasted, wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about standing beside someone when things got hard, about choosing each other again and again, even when it would be easier to walk away. Mara had lost almost everything once, but she'd built something better in its place. A home, a family, a life that was hers. And no one, no man, no law, no amount of money or power could take that from her. Not anymore. Not ever again. One evening, many years later, Mara sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her hands marked with the scars of a life lived hard and well. Elias sat beside her, older too, his beard more white than dark, his eyes still sharp and steady. Hope was grown and gone, living in town with a husband and a child of her own. She visited often, bringing laughter and stories and grandchildren who climbed trees and chased rabbits through the clearing. The world had changed. The frontier was fading, giving way to railways and telegraphs and a future Mara couldn't quite imagine. But the mountains remained, and the cabin, and the life they'd built. Elias reached over, took Mara's hand, and laced his fingers through hers. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Any of it?" Mara thought about it, about the fear and the pain and the nights she'd thought she wouldn't survive. And she thought about the strength she'd found, the love, the freedom. "No," she said, "not for a second." Elias squeezed her hand. "Good." They sat in silence, watching the light fade, and Mara felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace. Not the kind that came from having everything, but the kind that came from knowing you'd fought for what mattered, and won. The mountains stood silent around them, ancient and indifferent, witnesses to 1,000 stories just like theirs. But this one, this story, was Mara's. And it was enough.